Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my wife and myself, firstly, a warm word of thanks for the very warm welcome which we have been accorded here at the Alabama University. We felt at home from the very beginning. The provost treated us to a wonderful dinner. We had opportunity to meet the Nix family, who has so greatly contributed to the cause which brings us together today. Dr. Blackburn was there, and we really felt at home right from the beginning. In Africa, we have a word for rain. In most African languages, in some form or another, we call it pula. There's a Swazi lady here, a student from Swaziland, who will know what pula means. And there's this belief in Africa that when a guest arrives and it starts raining, it's a very good sign and it's good luck. I sincerely hope that the pula will bring you good luck in tomorrow's game, and that you will rise to the top of the log soon and stay there until the end of the season. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing could appear to be more secure or more American than Alabama here in the heartland of the South. And yet all of you here at the University of Alabama will ultimately be affected not just by what happens in the South or in the United States, but by developments on the global stage. Your future will also be affected by the rise of China and India, by the ongoing crisis in the Middle East and Iraq, by the global financial crisis, and by the increasingly inescapable reality of global warming and climate change. An important factor in determining the future well-being of the students of this university and the people of Alabama will be how the United States will play its global leadership role in a rapidly changing world that is full of threats, but also full of opportunities. And that is the topic that I would like to address today. And it is, of course, a topic that is at the center of the debate in the present presidential election. If the world has become a globalized village, there can be little doubt that for the time being, the United States is its mayor, its chief of police as well. America holds these positions not because it has been elected to them, but because of its unchallenged military, economic, and technological preeminence. America's role as de facto global leader bears with it heavy burdens and heavy responsibilities. The United States has to spend a disproportionate share of its national wealth on the upkeep of its global military reach and capability. Its preeminence makes it the target for disaffected groups all over the world. Osama bin Laden would not have targeted the World Trade Center and the Pentagon if they were not military and commercial symbols of the richest and the most powerful country in the world. The price of preeminence is, and always has been, unpopularity. America must endure the jealousy of some of its oldest allies and friends, many of whom delight in taking pot shots at her policies while safely sheltering beneath her strategic umbrella. The United States is likely to be criticized whatever it does. If it acts to enforce United Nations resolutions on Iraq, it is accused of imperialism. If it fails to intervene in other crises, such as the current conflict in Darfur, it is slated for being insensitive to the plight of Africans. To quote Bart Simpson, "You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't." Unfortunately, this is the price that must be paid for being the only remaining superpower. How then should America react to this burden? What challenges will confront it as global mayor and chief of police? When the United States first ascended the stage of world power at the beginning of the last century, President Teddy Roosevelt's approach was, and I quote, to speak softly and carry a big stick. He said that by so doing, America would go far. He was right. The big stick is undoubtedly necessary. After the terrorist outrage of 11 September 2001, it was essential for the United States to use its big stick against international terrorism. It was right and proper to overthrow the Taliban regime, which had provided the main operational base for terrorist attacks against America. It was and still is right for the United States and its NATO allies to continue to combat the resurgent Taliban forces in Afghanistan. It was and remains essential to put extreme pressure on any country providing a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. It was and still is equally important to launch a global campaign to track down terrorists wherever they might be hiding. In this, America's big stick played and continues to play an essential role. But what of Iraq? On the one hand, the reality is that if it had not been for the resolute action of the United States, Saddam Hussein would still be in power in Baghdad. He would still be doing everything in his power to deceive the international community, and he would still be repressing the Iraqi people. There can be no doubt about one thing. Iraq, the Middle East, and the world are better places after the toppling of his brutal regime. All these things are true. But it is equally important to remember Teddy Roosevelt's advice to speak softly. Military force has an essential place in international affairs. But at the end of the day, it cannot create lasting solutions. As we have seen all too clearly during the past 5 years, military force also carries with it immense risks. It is much easier to start wars than to end them. Also, the outcome of war is always uncertain. Let me take you back in history. The Austrians, the Russians, and the Germans did not think at the beginning of the First World War that the result would be the destruction of their ruling dynasties. And when Napoleon marched his grand army into Russia in 1812, he did not foresee the disaster that would soon befall him. History is full of similar examples which have persuaded wise leaders to resort to war only as the very last option. In the same way, one should think very carefully about beginning military adventures far from one's shores with few sure allies in very volatile neighborhoods. I believe that there are clear limitations to the use of the big stick. It is essential to deal with clear and present threats when it can be wielded swiftly, accurately, and effectively. But it is problematical when it requires long, costly, and unpopular operations on foreign soil. That is why the United States, in its global leadership role, should also and constantly consider the necessity of speaking softly. Speaking softly does not mean to be weak. Speaking softly requires a multilateral approach to international crises. It does not mean that the international community must forego the option of using the big stick. But it does mean that if it is finally used, there will be less criticism and a greater chance of success. The speaking softly option also recognizes that long-term solutions can be achieved only by addressing the root causes of conflict. And my submission is that those root causes are to be found in poverty, in repression, in ignorance, and in fanaticism. And the long-term way to combat terrorism must therefore include tackling these roots, tackling the roots of poverty, of repression and conflict. The challenge to world leaders is accordingly to address the following priorities. The first is the scourge of poverty. Poverty arising from the failure of some parts of the world to join in the global march to prosperity. The second is the promotion of good governance and fundamental human rights and freedoms. And the third is the peaceful resolution of the conflicts that continue to be at the root of so much instability and so much human suffering. We are living through one of the most profound developments in human history. The process that we have come to call globalization, some call it world integration. During the past decades, we have begun to lay the foundation of a new supranational global community. And one of the central implications of this community is that none of us, and particularly not the leading powers, can any longer ignore problems and grievances in distant countries. Non-performing economies cannot be ignored and merely just relegated to a basket case category outside of the mainstream of the global economy and commerce. And bloody crises and conflicts in distant countries cannot be dismissed with mere 30-second segments on the evening news. In the new millennium, it will be less and less possible to ignore the stark reality that a large part of the human population still lives in unacceptable poverty, misery, and repression. As we sit here this morning, ladies and gentlemen, 2 billion people throughout the world are living beneath the breadline. Millions of children do not have a meal to eat. They live under totally unacceptable circumstances. 12-year-olds are being taught how to use an AK-47. Some will argue that there has been progress, that the portion of the world population living in absolute poverty has declined from 2/3 to 1/3 in the past 45 years. And it's true. But the fact is that the total number of people living below the poverty line has stayed about the same at about 2 billion, because the world's population has more than doubled since 1960. Even more serious is the fact that the disparity between the poorest and the richest nations is widening. Let me give you a chilling statistic. In 2005, the GDP per capita here in the United States was almost $42,000 US, approximately 100 times more than the per capita income in the least developed countries. 100 times more. In a shrinking world, the problems of one region will inevitably become the problems of other regions and ultimately of the whole world. Diseases like AIDS, which first appeared in Africa, do not observe international borders. As we are now witnessing, the subprime crisis here in the United States is impacting on economies all over the world. No one knows where it will end, and we hope that the recently announced rescue packages will help to restore global confidence in the banking system. But what we cannot deny is that we are now having an increasingly integrated global financial system where a problem in one area can affect people all over the world. Conflicts and instability in distant societies can also reverberate throughout the whole international community. Developments in Georgia and Pakistan can affect the people living thousands of miles away, right here in Alabama. Who would have thought 8 years ago that the religious fanatics hiding in caves in distant Afghanistan could possibly pose a threat to the high-tech nerve center of the world's most powerful economy in downtown New York? Whether we live in the first world or in the third world, we also all share the same fragile global environment. The production of greenhouse gases, the decimation of tropical forests, and the extinction of animal and plant species will have long-term consequences for the whole planet. Make no mistake about it. Global warming is going to affect you, your children, and your grandchildren right here in Alabama. In our globalized society, such problems and conflicts will sooner or later breach international borders, and it will affect the interests of us all. It is equally true that the problems confronting a globalized world can no longer be dealt with unilaterally by any single country, regardless of how powerful or rich that country might be. Problems of global development, global security, and the protection of global environment can be dealt with effectively only if the international community works in concert. The United States can and must play a pivotal leadership role in this process, but it cannot achieve success alone. Under its leadership, and under the leadership of other prominent countries, the international community, I believe, should develop the policies, the resources, and the will to tackle the root causes of our global problems. We need to recognize the symbiosis between stability, prosperity, and freedom. None of these three can exist without the other two. Economic prosperity creates the environment in which democracy and free institutions can grow. And they in turn help to promote the stability that is essential for economic growth. There is an undeniable link between peace, development, growth, and democracy. Only 3 of the countries in the world with per capita incomes of less than $1,000 are full democracies, while nearly all of the 20 richest countries, those with per capita incomes of above $20,000, are democracies. There is also a link between the levels of development and peace. 11 of the 30 poorest countries, including Afghanistan, have in recent years been racked by devastating civil wars. On the other hand, none of the 20 richest countries currently experience serious internal conflict. How then can we achieve this necessary symbiosis between economic development, stability, democracy, and a vibrant civil society? I only have time for a few guidelines. In the sphere of the economy, the developed countries need to help to promote economic growth in the least developed societies. More attention needs to be given to the debt burden of the world's 41 most highly indebted poor countries, 34 of which are in Africa. Steps should also be taken to increase the third world's share in global trade. Once again, I'm going to give you a chilling statistic speaking as an African. Africa, with almost 17% of the world's population, accounts for only 2% of global trade. something must be wrong somewhere. Third world exports need more favorable access to first world markets. The unacceptable reality is that the world's most developed nations spend 280 billion US dollars on subsidies to their own farmers, and only 56 billion US dollars on foreign aid to help the 2 billion people, 1/3 of the world's population, living beneath the breadline. 5 times more to, numerically speaking, the handful of farmers in Europe and in America than to the 2 billion who are living beneath the breadline. What is worse is that the first world's agricultural subsidies often make it impossible for developing countries to compete in global markets for agricultural products, the one area where they may gain a competitive advantage because most undeveloped economies have to start with agriculture. And the poor countries require higher levels of foreign and domestic investment. Somehow or another, America and the G7 should develop an integrated, logical, overarching policy with regard to Africa and with regard to the poorest countries of the world. At present, the leading countries of the world deal with these problems in a knee-jerk way. We need something for Africa like the Marshall Plan was. We need proper planning, and I've asked many leading American politicians, do you have such a plan in place? And shamefacedly they say, no, unfortunately we don't. The international community also needs to continue its efforts to promote good governance, democracy, and the rule of law in third world countries. 20 of the 45 countries in sub-Sahara Africa are presently or have recently been involved in wars. And much of this instability can be ascribed to the lack of democratic mechanisms and the absence of the rule of law. The international community, I believe, should do more to encourage third world countries to proceed with democratic reforms and to protect the basic rights of all their citizens. It is for this reason that I started the Global Leadership Foundation. I brought together 26 former presidents, prime ministers, senior ministers. They come from all continents. 3 Americans are amongst them. And what we do is, we're not a talking shop. We form small teams. We sit down with the leadership who realize they need to change in developing countries. We work with them through their problems, help them to identify what initiatives they can take to move things forward in their countries or to prevent their countries from sliding into becoming failed states. I think the leading countries of the world should never hesitate to act also against regimes that grossly violate human rights and that subvert democracy. The government of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe is a recent prime example. And the United States also needs to adopt a more proactive stance in diffusing potential conflicts and in promoting the peaceful resolution of disputes. One of the fundamental causes, ladies and gentlemen, of conflict throughout the world lies in the inability of different ethnic and cultural groups to coexist peacefully within the same societies. In the post-Cold War world, conflict seldom takes place between countries. An authoritative study which has been done here in the USA shows that in 2000, for instance, only 2 of the 25 most significant conflicts that afflicted the world were between countries. The rest were people living in the same country, having the same nationality, the same citizenship, fighting against each other, and primarily between ethnic, cultural, and religious communities. The present or recent conflicts in the Sudan, in the Middle East, in former Yugoslavia, in Southern Asia, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Sri Lanka and Kenya are all evidence of this fact. The unresolved conflict in the Middle East is unfortunately a good example of both the challenge that the international community faces in this regard and of the risks that such a conflict can hold for the entire world. The simmering tension between Israel and the Palestinians continue to threaten the stability of the entire Middle East. It can affect oil production and can cause a major international economic crisis. The tension is causing enormous strains in relations between Muslims throughout the world and the West, and in particular the United States. And the passions that it has unleashed have created the environment in which fanaticism and terrorism can flourish. For all these reasons, the United States, as the preeminent world power, cannot afford to allow the conflict to linger on for decade after decade. Just as war is too important to be left to the generals, peace in the Middle East is too important to the key interests of the whole international community to be left solely to the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israelis and the Palestinians are simply going to have to find some way of learning to live together. This means that both sides will have to take risks. Both sides will have to make painful compromises. Both sides will have to accept that military force and suicide terrorist bombings will only accelerate their downward spiral into a deepening conflict. At the end of the conflict, after immense and unnecessary suffering, they will still have to negotiate. Although the situation looks desperate, I do not believe that it is hopeless. I recall, ladies and gentlemen, the dreadful period in South Africa's history, the dreadful period we went through between 1984 and 1987. We also were confronted by our own version of the Intifada. We also resorted to draconian security measures to restore order. We also experienced growing international isolation and condemnation. But we pulled back from the brink. We discovered that there was another way, that it was possible to solve our long-standing and bitter dispute through peaceful means. In the process, we learned a number of lessons. I'll deal with a few. We learned that we could not dictate with whom we would negotiate, whether we liked it or not. We had to sit eyeball to eyeball with people and parties that had been bitter enemies before. We learned that the negotiations should be as inclusive as possible. For that reason, we invited all parties with significant supports to join an open and transparent process rather than sitting in a dark corner and just make a deal between major parties. We learned that all sides had to take enormous risks and all sides had to make very painful compromises. And maybe most importantly of all, we learned that all sides had to accommodate the reasonable concern and interests of others. It was only when I and my party really put ourselves in the position of the ANC and their people, and when when we focused as much on which of their claims are reasonable and not on those which were unreasonable, that we could make progress. And it was only when the ANC, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, did the same and moved away from the stereotypes of my people that they've been fighting against, and asked what reasonable concerns we brought to the table. And it was only when both sides and other parties said, now how can we accommodate the reasonable concerns of the other side, that we succeeded in entering into an historic compromise. Finally, we emerged with a new constitution which guarantees the individual and collective rights of all our people, and which is enabling us to live together with one another in peace and cooperation. If we could do it, the Israelis and the Palestinians should also be able to do it. And I believe that the United States and the rest of the international community can play a major role in this process. The most eloquent response to global terrorism would be to achieve a settlement that would ensure the security of Israel, living in harmony with a viable Palestinian state. These, I believe, are the priorities that confront the United States in its global leadership role. The United States should take the lead in tackling the problem of underdevelopment and continuing third world poverty. It should take the lead in promoting conditions in which good governance, democracy, and basic human rights will be enjoyed by all mankind. And it should take the lead in finding peaceful solutions to the conflicts that continue to afflict the world, and particularly inter-community conflicts and the impasse between Israel and Palestine. And the United States, as the last remaining superpower, will inevitably have to play a disproportionate role in addressing these challenges. It will have to take the lead. It is part of the burden of world leadership. However, ladies and gentlemen, there is perhaps only one thing more burdensome than being the most powerful country in the world, and that is no longer being the most powerful country in the world. World leadership is a difficult business. It requires huge expense. It requires patience to endure the jealousy and criticism of much of the rest of the world. It requires perseverance to address the underlying causes of global conflict. But above all, it requires firm and continuing belief in and commitment to the ideals for which your country stands. It should be remembered that most of the great civilizations in history declined and disappeared from the world stage because they lost belief in their faiths and in the ideals that inspired their birth and their growth. In shouldering the burden of world leadership, Americans should not forget why their country became so preeminent in the first place. The key to addressing its global role may be for the United States to resist the temptation of becoming absorbed with what it is accused of doing wrong. It should perhaps redouble its commitment to the things that it has done right and which made it great. The United States, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the freest and the most democratic countries that the world has ever seen. Many other countries have liberal democratic constitutions, but the freedom of their citizens is hemmed in on every side by bureaucratic and nanny state restrictions. Right now, you are involved in one of your great 4-yearly celebrations of democracy, your presidential election that will take place next month. You have no idea how your politics impact on the whole world in our domestic village. Hundreds of millions of people around the world are watching the process with almost as much interest as the Americans themselves. The outcome of your elections is so important to the world as a whole that somehow people watching the process from overseas feel they should also have the vote. This is another important dimension of globalization. However, there are many other aspects of your systems that people all over the world admire. In the United States, there are few restrictions on individual entrepreneurs to pursue their dreams, and by so doing to contribute greatly to the commonwealth of the country. Your country still nurtures a healthy spirit of free competition, not only between individuals and companies, but also between cities and states competing for investment. All this has contributed to your excellence in scientific discovery and technological innovation, and to your economic dynamism. In the final analysis, the greatness of the United States does not lie in the undoubted strength of its armies, its navies, and its air force. It lies in the values and the ideals of personal and economic freedom that it represents. Your country, as the leading country in the world, can remain true to these ideals. It will succeed in carrying out its historic role as the global leader, the strongest country in the world, a country to which the rest of the world needs to look up to, want to look up to. The world out there needs strong leadership from the United States of America if we are to assure that justice will prevail. If we are to assure that the scourge of poverty will be tackled in a meaningful way. If we are to be sure that we will succeed in broadening democracy and human rights so that more and more people can benefit and can be safe and can have a fair deal in life. If we are to be sure that we can minimize and reduce the number of conflicts in which so many people die unnecessarily, to bring peace, to make this world a better world. I thank you very much.